Now I want to talk about the second article in Unit 2, Love. And the article is by Brake, by Elizabeth Brake, and it's called Is Loving More Better? The Values of Polyamory. Now, I hope this article was a little bit more straightforward than the previous article, than the Bagley article, because it's not putting forward as sophisticated a view. What it's doing is it's basically defining polyamory and defending it against common objections. And again, I hope you find it more straightforward, and I hope that this video will be shorter than the last one, because otherwise no one will watch it. All right, so she starts off by defining polyamory as essentially the etymology of it is that it means many loves. What makes it, and essentially she defines it as not monogamy. So it doesn't have as rigid a definition. It's not defined by the formal structure of the relationships, and she goes on to describe several different kinds of relationship that could count as polyamorous. You could have ones where there was no official relationship, where people just drift about from person to person, or you could have long-term relationships amongst couples who are open to temporary relationships with other people, or between more than two people, that is a long-term relationship of more than two. So it covers a broad range of relationships in contrast with monogamy. She also states that it's not defined as a sexual orientation, although at the end of the article she returns to consider whether there aren't any advantages to defining it as a sexual orientation, because that way, if it is defined as a sexual orientation, then it fits more neatly into civil rights protections, which will protect polyamorous individuals from housing discrimination, for example. If it was defined as an orientation, then you couldn't be as easily booted from your housing and things like that. But for now, she says it's not really a sexual orientation. So in other words, you can be gay and polyamorous, you can be straight and polyamorous, and so on. On page 203, the best summary of her view is, she says, polyamory is best characterized as adopting and consequently practicing a certain set of attitudes towards monogamy, exclusivity, love, and sex. So, attitudes towards monogamy and exclusivity. Again, it sounds like it's defined negatively as not monogamy. And she will go on to say that this could be seen as a positive thing. It could be seen as better than monogamy in many respects. But to begin with, she's going to defend it against criticisms. All right, so polyamory involves commitment to a set of values, honesty, for example, and we'll list those later on. And it's not behaviors alone. So, for example, if someone just sleeps around and has many partners, like Wilt Chamberlain famously, that doesn't make them polyamorous, simply by having sex with a lot of different people. You have to believe things. You have to be committed to principles. It's not simply sexual relationships as well. It must involve romantic love. So, swinging, for example, she says, that doesn't make you polyamorous automatically. However, it must involve sex. So, because she says otherwise, it's just friendship, because most people, the vast majority of people, have friendships with more than one person, with several different people, but that doesn't make them polyamorous. There has to be some kind of sexual attraction or behavior involved. to clear up some misconceptions about polyamory, she says it is possible to cheat within a polyamorous relationship. People might say, well, cheating is impossible because you can have sex with anybody. Well, no, cheating means violating the principles of polyamory, which, as we've already said, and she'll go into, include honesty. So if you're dishonest within a polyamorous relationship, that could count as cheating. Now, on page 204, she considers what a philosopher called Jenkins calls modal monogamy. Now, this seems to be an assumption that is built into Benjamin Bagley's view, because modal monogamy is the view that it is conceptually impossible to love more than one person at one time. And she's going to say that if that were correct, then clearly polyamory is impossible, because polyamory is to love more than one person at a time. And at this point, we should probably clarify what kind of love, because people are not polyamorous if they love their partner and they love their children. Assuming that they love them in different ways. They're not sexually attracted to their children, one hopes. That kind of different love, having familial love for your children and for your parents and for your siblings, while having romantic love for your partners, that doesn't make you polyamorous. Polyamorous must be having the same kind of romantic love for more than one person. So it has to be romantic love. And clearly, if modal monogamy is true, then polyamory is just conceptually impossible. It can't happen. So she has to reject that. Jenkins argument, who coined the term modal monogamy, is many people report loving greater than one person. Now, this in itself, you might say, is not enough, because if you remember in the Bagley article, Catherine Earnshaw claims to love both Linton and Heathcliff. But clearly it's a different kind of love. Does she really love Linton? It's not clear. Whereas she obviously does love Heathcliff in the way that, is most representative of romantic love, the paradigm of romantic love for Bagley. So merely people reporting loving greater than one person, I'm not sure that's enough to make the point, because it may be different kinds of love. And again, think of the example of if you watch the movie, and I think you should because it's a great movie. Believe me, I didn't want to watch it at first because it seemed so staid and old-fashioned. But if you watch the movie Brief Encounter, the first of the movies for this unit, the main woman involved says that she loves her husband, and of course she falls in love with this doctor that she meets. So she claims to be loving two people, but does that make the point that modal monogamy is false? It seems to be a different kind of love involved. There's sort of feelings of loyalty and affection for her husband, but it's not the same kind of head over heels thing that she feels for the doctor. The second point that Jenkins makes against modal monogamy, we love greater than one child at a time. So why should romantic love be any different? Again, comparing romantic love with familial love, with the kind of love one has for one's children. And it's certainly true that you do love your children. You do love both your children with any luck equally if you have more than one, or both or more. If you have more than one child, you do love all your children. You don't just love one. You're not just in love with one at a time. Although, of course, the oldest child always never feels quite the same after the second child is born. So, if that's a perfectly respectable kind of love, and it's perfectly possible to love more than one person in that way, why shouldn't romantic love be the same? So, that modal monogamy, which would rule out the very possibility of polyamory has to be questioned, and those are the reasons for questioning it. Might still turn out to be right, and certainly I think someone like Bagley would assume that it was, but for the time being, it's at least in question. All right, then we move on to types of criticism of polyamory, and she divides these into two main groups. The first group argues that polyamory in itself is inherently or intrinsically wrong. There's something about polyamory itself that makes it bad. And contrasted with that, with the second kind of criticism, second cluster of criticisms, which says that polyamory in itself might not be bad, but it has bad effects, so therefore it should be prevented. And to illustrate the difference, she uses an analogy of objections to assisted suicide. The first kind of criticism, that it is intrinsically wrong, might say that assisted suicide violates a principle. She says respect for persons, but you might say it violates the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Even killing yourself is supposed to be violating that principle. So that would make assisted suicide, the very act of it, inherently wrong. It cannot be good. Just like murder. Murder by definition is wrong. If it's murder, it's wrong. It's built into the concept of murder. So that would be reasons for opposing assisted suicide, because it's wrong in itself. The alternative is to say assisted suicide in itself is not wrong, but it has possibly bad effects. Like, for example, the common argument against allowing assisted suicide is that while it might not be a bad thing, and while killing yourself is not necessarily wrong, if we allow it, it will exert pressure on older people who, knowing that other old people have committed suicides to avoid being a burden on their family, will feel a pressure to do the same. They'll feel a pressure that their family shouldn't have to care for them anymore and they should kill themselves. So it will lead to the death of people who don't actually want to kill themselves. So that would be the second kind of criticism, that it's wrong because of the effects it brings. All right, back to polyamory. First kind of criticism that argue that polyamory in itself is inherently wrong. First suggestion is that it's wrong because it's deceptive, and she quickly dismisses this. This is Brake, quickly dismisses this. It's not deceptive. Just because it involves sleeping around, people think it's like cheating, and cheating is deceptive in a monogamous relationship because you have to lie. But if it's polyamory, you don't have to lie, and in fact polyamory is committed to honesty. So if anything, polyamory is less deceptive than monogamy, than certainly cheating within monogamy. So that's not a reason that polyamory is inherently wrong. That involves a misunderstanding of it. All right, the second suggestion for why polyamory might be inherently wrong is because it undermines expectations. You know, you fall in love with someone, you expect them to be your one and only, but then they say, actually, you know, I'd like to keep things open, I'm polyamorous. You would be very disappointed, goes the criticism. And she says, well, this isn't a criticism against polyamory in itself, it's a criticism of polyamorous people who lead people on. If, on the other hand, you follow the principles of honesty in polyamory, you will fully disclose your polyamorousness before anyone has a chance to, you know, fall head over heels in love with you, and there won't be expectations. On the other hand, you know, you can't get rid of all expectations. Anyway, people have expectations. That's not your fault if someone expects certain things from you that you never said would be true. Like people expect you to become, you know, to come to love what they love. And if they love, like Velleman's kids in the last article, Morris dancing, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. So saying that polyamory undermines expectations doesn't pick out a particularly bad feature of polyamory. It's just true of anything, and it needn't necessarily be true if you fully disclose things. All right, third attempt to say that polyamory is inherently wrong. Because sex outside of monogamy is just inherently wrong. This criticism doesn't, is taken less seriously, certainly in this day and age. But if you look at the attitudes in two of the movies, Brief Encounter and In the Mood for Love, they are committed to this principle. Sex outside of monogamy, or even attraction outside of monogamy is wrong. Which is why, to our great regret, they fight their urges in both movies. The philosopher who most famously defended this view and gave an account rather than just saying, well, it's wrong, is Immanuel Kant. Now, his view is complicated, and you have to understand Kant's view. I talked a little bit about Kant in the Bagley article. And he's the one who says that you have a duty to respect the capacity for rational choice in other people. And in fact, you have a duty to respect that in yourself. And one thing you must never do is use another person as if they were a thing. You cannot use them as a means to your ends. You cannot manipulate them. And according to Kant, if you have sex outside of marriage, or even if you masturbate, you are using your body for your body or someone else's, for the end of sexual gratification. And it's as if, I guess, one way to put it is, he regards sex outside of marriage as treating other people like dildos or something. You are using them as a means to your gratification and not respecting them as a person. And you're not respecting yourself if you masturbate. Now, it's kind of hard to take this seriously. I mean, philosophers do take it seriously because Immanuel Kant is a very great philosopher. But as Brake says, first of all, what about polyfidelity? If you are in a faithful, say, three-way relationship and you're all faithful to each other, isn't that like the marriage? Because Kant has to say that sex within a marriage where you're faithful and you give yourself up equally to each other, that's okay. And his account of why that's okay is a little bit convoluted. But if that's okay, then why isn't it okay in like a triad or something like that? But more basically, isn't informed consent enough? I mean, so long as isn't respecting your partner just getting their informed consent? Haven't you done enough? They want it, you want it. What's wrong with that? There can't be something immoral in that. And it seems like Kant's intuition that it is tied to his sort of 18th century morality. In fact, as Brake says, Kant has to explain what's special about sex. It seems like he's got some kind of a hang-up about sex. We interact with people and use them in ways all the time. Classic example, if I go to the bank and get money out, I'm using the bank teller to get at my money. Why isn't that wrong? It's because they consent to it. Okay, so what's different about sex? Kant has to explain what's different about sex, and it just seems like there isn't really anything. And the next attempt to say that polyamory is inherently wrong is to say that it's shallow. The philosopher Chris Bennett? I think so. This on page 208 suggests that being the only one confirms a sense of specialness, and that's what's distinctive about monogamy, and that's what makes it special. So yeah, you have a quote from Chris Bennett on page 208. Being special for someone else affirms and recognizes your sense that the things that make you a particular individual are valuable because someone has chosen you for those things. In this, he sounds a lot like Bagley. He sounds like he and Bagley would agree about a lot of things. So presumably that sense of specialness is lacking in in polyamorous relationships. However, Brake says, can't you get that kind of specialness again in a triad or in polyamorous couples? Maybe you're committed to each other to live together and to build a life together, but not for sex, that you have sex outside of those and you have an open relationship. Can't you get specialness in those relationships? Here you might turn to Bagley and see what he says. Maybe he would be open to that. No pun intended. But because he never specifically argues that the kind of love that he talks about in improvisation could be monogamous, because after all, improvisation can be in a group. But anyway, that's Brake's response. Page 209, we get another suggested criticism of polyamory being inherently wrong is you get less love in polyamory because you have to share it. Brake says, but love is not zero-sum, just as the love of children and friends. Zero-sum is when is a term meaning that if say love is zero-sum, then if somebody gets more, somebody else has to get less. In other words, there's a set quantity of it, and if you give more of that quantity to one person, you can only do it by taking it away from somebody else. Whereas she says love isn't like that. If I give love to one child, I can give just as much love to the other. I don't have a set quantity of love that I have to distribute amongst them. Love is not like that. Again, I think the oldest child would probably, if my older sister is any indication, or my elder child, they have things to say about this. They tend to think that once the second child shows up, they get less love. But they get less attention, maybe, but that doesn't mean they get less love. And Brake also says, in response to both the last two criticisms, different people want different things. To assume that you get less of something in a polyamorous relationship doesn't necessarily make it bad if that's not the thing that people want out of it. Maybe polyamorous people want spontaneity over stability, and they're okay with sharing their love. All right, last inherent criticism of polyamory. This is a little vague, that monogamy is the objective standard, the best kind of relationship. It's just true. See, now, this would require arguing for, and presumably if you argued for it, you'd give one of the other reasons. So maybe this has already been tackled. Because, when people sleep around, when people are unfaithful in their monogamous relationships, we regard them as having slipped, as having failed somehow. So that sounds like we have this idea that monogamy is the ideal that you've got to try and live up to. And insofar as you don't, you are less worthy. And polyamory is therefore less worthy for failing to live up to this standard. But she says, right back at you, maybe monogamy is just something we settle for because people can't handle the strict principles of polyamory. People can't handle the honesty, so they claim to be monogamous and yet cheat. Whereas polyamory requires you to be truly honest about your feelings, and people just aren't capable of doing that. So maybe polyamory is the true standard, and we only settle for monogamy because we're flawed and incapable of living up to polyamory's high standards. All right. On to the second cluster of criticisms, which is that maybe polyamory isn't bad in itself, but it has bad side effects. First kind of side effects that might be bad are on children. Elizabeth Emmons, on page 210, is cited for describing a case where a judge removes custody from a polyamorous parent for being a poor role model to the children. However, another Elizabeth Sheff, did a study over 15 years and 22 kids of polyamorous families to check to see if they were worse off or better off. And there were two themes that emerged in this study. First, that the kind of blended families that you see in polyamorous relationships are, of course, not unique to polyamorous relationships. They're quite common nowadays. The Brady Bunch is an example, if you remember that. So that's from the 70s, where, parents, you have step siblings and so on. That happens in monogamy. So, why monogamy is polyamory is no worse than that. And second, polyamorists have actually arguing that multiple parenting benefits kids. And the benefits that they suggest you get from polyamorous parenting is more rides. I guess, when kids want to go somewhere, there's always some member of the polyamorous unit available to give them a ride. More money. There's more people involved, so there's more money to contribute to the various kids. More love. Again, more people, more love to give. More supervision. Variety of parenting styles. So, if you can't get one parent to buy you the Xbox because they think it's spoiling you, find another one who thinks that it's okay. And also the emphasis on honesty. So again, if we stick up for the standards of polyamory, those are high standards, and it's good for the children to be taught that honesty is good. Now, she admits there are cons, there are downsides to polyamory. You lose certain parent figures in shifting relationships. Uncle Joe disappears when Mom moves on. But of course, that needn't be the case. If Uncle Joe wants to stay in your life, he will. And also social stigma. That's certainly true. If people find out that you're the child of a polyamorous relationship, as things stand, they will mock you. You will certainly hear it in the playground from the other kids. But again, that's true of all kinds of relationships, like possibly mixed race or gay parents, and that doesn't mean that they're bad. That means the society is bad for having the wrong attitudes. Next, criticism of a bad side effect, that polyamorous relationships typically have bad gender politics. And again, this is bad for the children because it sort of programs the children to accept bad attitudes about gender politics. And it's certainly true that the most common form of polyamory is polygamy, and most notoriously in certain splinter Mormon sects, as in the TV series Big Love that was on HBO a few years ago. If that's the kind of polyamory, then it seems kind of repressive. And certainly, as I believe the show documented, there's competition between wives, the insecurity of the wives that they're getting squeezed out in favor of new favorites. It's a stressful environment for both the wives and the children. In response to this, Brake says some feminists endorse polyamory as a rejection of the patriarchy. It's certainly true that in these splinter Mormon sects, the patriarchy is, if anything, endorsed even more strongly. The man gets to have many wives, but of course you don't get polyandry, which is one woman, multiple husbands. That doesn't happen so much. But that's no fault of polyamory in principle. So that's a criticism of this particular kind of polygamy, but not a criticism of polyamory in general. Another kind of possible bad side effects is practical risks for the partners, like STDs from your partner having sex with so many different people. But again, Brake says polyamory is committed to honesty, and if you know your partner is polyamorous, you're much more likely to take precautions. Whereas if you think you're in a monogamous relationship and your partner is lying and cheating, you're much more at risk. So actually, polyamory makes you safer, says Brake. Another possible practical risk is unfair treatment. That is, the allocation of time and affection is an issue if your partner has other partners than you, whereas in monogamy it's just one other person. You've got all their time and affection, in theory. In response to this, she says polyamory encourages criticism of hierarchies. Take that as you will. That's on page 211. See what you think of that one. Okay, then we move on to the positive values of polyamory. So the first stage is to argue that polyamory is not wrong. Now we're going to argue that polyamory might actually be better than monogamy. And she quotes a guy called Luke Brunning, who believes this. He argues that polyamory is more emotionally challenging because, more people involved. It's harder to structure your relationships, but also more emotionally rich. You have to work harder, but you get more out of it. And the principles of polyamory are radical honesty, as we've been saying all along, and non-possessiveness. Now, for non-possessiveness, she cites John McMurtry, who says, monogamy is an ideological tool of capitalism. So in being monogamous, you're helping the capitalist system up in its oppression and alienation of the citizenry. So if you rejecting capitalism, looking for a more fair society, also requires rejecting monogamy. Dossie Easton, who wrote the book Ethical Slut, endorses polyamory because of her experience. She was in a possessive and abusive monogamous relationship, and in escaping that, she rejects relationships like that and sees polyamory as the solution to avoiding that. It is non-possessive. Once you have possessiveness, that leads to controllingness. Just an interjection from me, you're going to have possessive people in polyamorous relationships too. I think possessiveness is a problem for the people involved, and I don't think necessarily that monogamy is going to exacerbate that. But having said that, are social structures being set up around monogamy means that possessive people have more social and legal tools to control you in a monogamous relationship. I mean, that's obviously true where divorce is illegal, or where you have to have strict reasons for divorce. Then usually the male, and almost universally the male, can control the wife much more effectively. If you don't have that, then women can escape abusive relationships and men can escape abusive relationships much more easily. Deborah Anapol, again with the theme of non-possessiveness, argues for something that she calls compersion. She says, ideally, partners in polyamorous relationships will not be jealous. They will have the very opposite of jealousy, which she calls compersion. So if jealousy is feeling this bad, sick feeling when you observe your lover being loved by another, compersion is you feel good for your partner when they're getting sexual enjoyment with another person. Now, if you're skeptical of this, I wish I'd kept the name of the person. In the New York Times, there was an obituary of a woman who was a literary editor in England who died at age about 101. And she'd gotten famous fairly late in life for writing a series of very racy autobiographies, volumes of autobiography, where she describes, her sex life. And one of the relationships that she describes is she was in this relationship with a man, and he took a younger lover, and the younger lover moved in with them, and she was very fond of this younger lover, and she claimed felt no jealousy and was happy for her male partner that he got to have, sex with this younger woman. There you go. So there would be an example. If you are skeptical of the very existence of compersion. Finally, almost finally, on page 213-14, she suggests that there could be benefits to society if polyamory was the system that of the standard of relationships rather than monogamy. She says post-monogamy might be like post-racial and post-gender. Both of those are seen to be good. We move past racist attitudes. We move past sexist or controlling attitudes. We should move past monogamy in the same way. That kind of begs the question. But secondly, communal living is actually good for society because it's ecological. It's like carpooling, I guess. If everybody just is one to a car, that's terrible for the environment. But if you're carpooling, if you're more than one person to the household, more than two people to a household, better for the environment. It's more fun, she says, a polyamorous society, more flirting and experimentation. And oddly, you might think, she says it's less sexualized. And I guess what she means is sex is more frank and open and not suppressed. Give you an analogy. I hope most of you are unfamiliar with a comedian called Benny Hill. He was one of the more successful and embarrassing exports of Britain in the 70s. And his brand of humor was very nudge, nudge, wink, wink, very sort of double entendres. And it was just drenched in sexual innuendo. And a lot of people suggest that it's no accident that a comedy like that came out of Britain, which at the time was very sexually repressed. So the more you repress sexuality, the more it emerges, more sort of things become sexualized. Whereas if we're all open about sex, if we're all we know that anybody can have sex with anybody else at any time, there's no need to suppress it, and it doesn't sort of creep into other areas of our life. Another example is, I remember my wife, when she was a teenager, went to study in Germany, and she noticed that German preschools had the kids would run around naked in the playground, and she was amazed by this. But the Germans were very insistent that there was nothing wrong with this, and if you saw something wrong with this, it was because you had sexual hang-ups, that you were sexualizing their nakedness. And they see this as a criticism of the repression of American standards. So that's the kind of idea that we have here. So in saying that it's less sexualized, she isn't saying that people are having less sex. In fact, she goes on to say that maybe a wider variety of people could have sex. Ugly people could get more sex, she says in not so many words, but that's what she's saying, because sex isn't connected with, if you have sex with someone, you have to then marry them and live with them. So obviously you're saving yourself for the best person, and you're not going to have sex with ugly people. If, on the other hand, sex is just for fun, then sure, why not? And more people would get access to sex and fun in a polyamorous society. But at the same time, society would be less sexualized. And finally, polyamory is more suited to human nature. I mean, given the rampant cheating that goes on in supposedly monogamous relationships, it just looks like we're naturally polyamorous, and wouldn't it be better if we acknowledge that fact? The final section on page 214 and 15 is on law and politics. And she asks, well, what about marriage? Should polyamorous marriage be legal? And this actually reminds me of the debate that when gay marriage was still illegal, and there was a push to legalize it, some gay activists weren't interested in a push to legalization because they actually saw gay relationships as better because there wasn't this institution. There's a joke of the time, which is, why do gay people want into our worst institutions, the army and marriage? And this is sort of the idea here. Why should polyamorous people want marriage? Marriage is sort of a vestige of monogamy, and polyamory doesn't need it. Polyamory needs to be more open. And it would just be it would be a huge legal tangle. I mean, how do you add partners to a marriage? How do you distribute responsibility? But on the flip side, unless you do have laws that respect polyamorous relationships, somehow institutionalize them, what about things like child support? It would be very hard to get child support and things like that. So the advantages of having marriage are the same ones that gay people fought for. You can, if you die, automatically your goods go to your spouse. If you get visitation rights when you're in hospital, that kind of thing. So it is important, but it is, with polyamory, it's a huge legal tangle. And last, she says, should we consider polyamory like sexuality? And again, for civil rights reasons. If it is like sexuality, then it looks like it would be an easy step to get protections. Although, of course, gay people don't get as many protections as they should. But that's the idea. And she considers whether or not bisexuals are sort of like a sexuality that is polyamorous. That seems a bit dubious, and I don't think that's a major point. All right, so there you go. It's interesting to see the contrast between Brake and Bagley. Bagley seems to assume modal monogamy, but maybe not necessarily. Maybe you could say he should be arguing for group improvisation, and he should be open to polyamory. Of the movies that you watch, you could say that Brief Encounter and In the Mood for Love are people tortured by monogamy, and maybe they would be better off in polyamory. And then on the sort of, well, I don't know if it's more positive side, you see the character Nola Darling in She's Gotta Have It is committed to polyamory, and you can see the troubles that arise. But maybe those troubles arise because of bad attitudes of monogamous people and not because polyamory itself is bad. So, plenty of stuff to think about.